Hi, I'm Bob Spinozzi, and welcome to Small Town. Patriots' Day this year will be a very special day. On Saturday, April 19th, we're going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the shot heard round the world. Today's show, we're going to talk about the battles in Lexington and Concord, battles that triggered our independence from Great Britain. Then later, we'll look at some of the industry that developed in our region as America ushered in the Industrial Revolution. Now, the 250th celebration will be centered in Lexington Common and Concord's Old North Bridge, where Minutemen from neighboring towns fought for their independence. Joining me to discuss this historical event is Carolyn Mueller, curator for the Littleton Historical Society. Carolyn, thanks so much for being with me.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was fun.
You know, when we look back, there was not one particular cause that really started the revolution. It was just in opposition to a lot of the things that the British were doing to the colonies.
You're right. There was a lot that went on before April 19th, 1775. The fight for independence really started a decade earlier and lasted until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. But I think we get so wrapped up in Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill in our area that we kind of forget about the lead up and the subsequent battles. I remember when I was a kid and found out that the revolution was fought in South Carolina and Georgia, I was amazed.
I know.
You know, you don't think of it being down that way.
No, but let's get into some of the things that led up to the revolution. In our history books, I remember reading about the Stamp Act. Right. I think that was around 1773, perhaps.
No,
then the Boston Tea Party. Get into some of that.
Right. Well, the Stamp Act was a tax that was imposed on the colonies by the British. It required that every piece of paper in the colonies had a revenue stamp on it, whether it was a legal document, a newspaper, magazine, even playing cards. And it was just one of the impositions that the British Parliament put on the colonies. There was the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Quartering Act. These were all done in kind of a flurry. And it was to help pay for the French and Indian War, which the British had just come out of. The Stamp Act seems to be the one that really set off the action, though. You've heard taxation without representation. Right, exactly. It was really more that than the actual tax that was levied. Taxes were levied by Parliament, and not by the king, but by Parliament. And like our Congress, Parliament was representatives for the people. So it could be said that, you know, the people levy the taxes. But the colonies were not part of that body. They requested to be part of the representation, but they were turned down because we were too far away. Our goals were different than the motherland. It was just impractical. So the colonists all felt, especially here in Massachusetts, that it was an intolerable form of tyranny. So this is, 10 years before the shot heard around the world, like you said. But it was the response to the Stamp Act. It was a core group of colonists who got together. You hear the names Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams, James Otis. They were organizing peaceful and diplomatic protests, but as we know, that didn't stay peaceful and diplomatic.
But it was the Stamp Act, actually, that pretty much triggered everything. But in our history books, we're always told about the Boston Tea Party, and they used to, I don't know if they still do, have a reenactment every year of that. That was more the British telling us, I believe, that we had to buy tea from them.
Right, there was, again, taxes and all, and even before, so the Tea Party was in 1773, but back in 1770, the Boston Massacre, which was a real turning point, and again, still 5 years before Lexington Concord, 3 years before the Boston Tea Party. But the massacre was a significant event that really turned the colonist sentiment toward the king in the other direction. Samuel Adams, the Sons of Liberty, you've probably heard of, he used that incident to really rally the forces in the colonies and started strings of protests. In 1770, Littleton and other towns around us passed resolutions at town meetings to oppose the taxes. and that were given to us by Parliament on imported goods. They also said that they would support any other Boston merchant who would not buy goods from England. The resolution also burned the purchase of British tea and proposed strict sanctions against anybody who did. So that came right from Littleton. That's in our town meeting records, which is kind of cool. So in 1773, a little bit before the Boston Tea Party, towns were requested to reply to a letter by what was called the Boston Committee to state Littleton's policies. And the resolution that was passed said in part, "We shall always be ready to join with the towns of this province in a regular and constitutional method in preserving our liberties and privileges." So you can see the sentiment that was happening. Building.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, in Littleton, we had so many Tories who were loyal to the king versus the Patriots. Consensus was really hard to achieve. They went back and forth. It took 3 meetings before they could come to consensus, and the resolution was accepted. So they replied, firmly stating, "A revenue is imposed on this as well as the other colonies and extorted from us and appropriated to most destructive purpose." So you can, again, this was all in that 5 years before it even gets to Lexington and Concord.
So things are building up now. And in fact, you're going to start talking about how they organized a month earlier in March is when they really started, the British started planning their assault.
Right. So the British were in Boston, and they were planning to send troops to Lexington and to Concord to destroy the gunpowder and other military supplies that they had. They sent spies in to learn about the landscape, where there were hills, where there were trees, places to hide. They also tried to find the military stores of gunpowder and all in Concord. And they actually were helped out by a Tory, Daniel Bliss, who was living in Concord, who actually flew the coop with them afterwards before he was caught. So thinking a few days before April 19th, April 15th, some of the British regiments had been taken off their patrols supposedly for exercises. And Paul Revere, who, famously we know Paul Revere, he noticed this, and it kind of clicked something in his brain. So he reported it to Dr. Joseph Warren, who we also is a big player in the Revolution, who reported it to the committees of safety. So people kind of knew something was going on, and they somehow in their intelligence surmised that they were coming to Concord to seize the
But even
arsenal.
though Boston it's a pretty good distance from Concord, Concord was the ultimate destination because that's where the storage was centered on.
Yes.
The munitions
Yes.
and other military supplies.
Right, and so they had stuff like buried in the fields and hidden in barns. So, and again, you have Tories, so you have, almost homegrown spies within your town who really were against breaking away from the
From
crown.
England, yeah.
Right. So John Hancock and Samuel Adams went to Lexington later that day to kind of wait there. And the next morning, Paul Revere, and they rode back and forth to Boston to Lexington like it was nothing. So Paul Revere rode out to Lexington and warned them that, the British were starting to move. He'd also noticed that some of the boats that had been up on land were suddenly being put in the water. So, they put 2 and 2 together and knew something was imminently happening. And then he returned later that night with a plan to start warning the colonists.
Right, and we read in our history books that was the signal, one by land, 2 is by sea.
That's right. The signal would communicate to Lexington, so they knew, and the next day, so they had a couple of days to prepare while all this was going on, both the British and the colonists. So they voted to transport some of the cannon from Concord to Groton, which, interestingly, they must have gone through Littleton.
Sure.
To have a diary or something from that time period would be so cool. So, of course, the cannon, they brought, I think, 6 cannon to Groton, which kind of piqued the interest of the Groton Minutemen. So some of them marched off to Concord. So this is, again, a few days before. That evening, a Lexington resident who had been in Boston on business came back and started to say that they saw a patrol of British soldiers. And John Hancock, who had been in Menotomy, which is now Arlington, also saw British soldiers on patrol. So they, started gearing up. So about 8 o'clock that night, some of the British horsemen came out to Lexington. They came through into Lincoln, going toward Concord, and they were watching this all go on. But there were 3 scouts of the colonists that were captured by the British, and they just kind of held them for a few hours. But simultaneously, Paul Revere and William Dawes were sent to, they dispatched them out to see what was going on. Samuel Prescott joined up with them, and they were going toward Concord when this British patrol caught them. Now, Dawes was able to make a U-turn, hightail it back to Lexington. Prescott jumped over a stone wall and continued on to Concord, and Paul Revere was captured. There's a stone marking his capture place, but he was only held for a few hours and then let go.
Now, a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned Minutemen. Let's talk about the Minutemen, and specifically the ones that who were associated with Littleton.
So they were called Minutemen because they had to be ready in a minute. As we get to talking about it, you'll see how, it was quite quick when they had to be ready. So they had been mustering for a number of times, for, quite a while. It was, in Littleton, it was like 75% of the men were mustering and, practicing and going through the exercises. There were older, people who were in their 50s and 60s who obviously didn't stay in the militia. And then anyone who could pick up a gun, they were hunters, they were farmers, they all knew how to use a rifle. So they had, everybody, all the men in Littleton were really practicing for years.
I think I read somewhere that every town in the Commonwealth, they were required to have Minutemen,
To set up a militia.
Minutemen. But we had the Littleton Minutemen. They teamed up with the Boxborough Minutemen, the Acton Minutemen, to proceed on to the Old North Bridge. Is that
right? Yeah, and in Boxborough, like some of our Minutemen lived in what was Boxborough, but it wasn't really a town then. And when we marched to Concord, we met up with everyone and marched as a unit. So they all helped each other out. They were all farmers, and they were all fighting for a cause that by this time they believed in. So it would be really interesting to have some firsthand accounts of what the tenor was like in Littleton at that time, but we don't have that.
You don't have that.
No.
Well, that's great. By the way, the shot heard around the world, that's actually credited to Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a poem in 1837 called The Concord Hymn. And you mentioned that was a shot heard around the world. Yeah.
Which is interesting because Lexington actually had the first shot.
Lexington had the first shot, and coincidentally to us recording the show today, the Boston Globe last Sunday, one of their front page articles was how the towns of Concord and Lexington still to this day are vying for the first shot heard around the world. Of course, it was in Lexington, though.
Right. Yes, it's semantics, as every argument usually comes down to.
Yeah.
But, Concord was really the first clash, and it's romanticized, of course. And when the British started putting people down in Lexington, and then the Patriots came up to Lexington. The Patriots were really outnumbered. So, they were saying at that time they didn't want them to fire first, let somebody else fire. And it was the British that probably had the first shot. In fact, they were starting to have the colonists leave until that volley hit, and then there were eight people who were killed and 10 that were wounded. So that's really the first real battle.
Well, we're going to hear a heck of a lot about it, starting from now until the 19th of April.
Right.
So.
Yes, and we are at the Historical Society this month. In the next couple of months, we have a display which will tell you all about those men who were the Minutemen in Littleton.
Okay.
We kind of focus in on the people, and we'll have a lot of festivities on April 19th.
Okay, I'll look forward to that.
Yes,
Absolutely.
I hope so. It's great.
Thank you for being with me.
Oh, absolutely.
And we'll be right back. I'd like to switch gears and look at some of the businesses that started in our area. Let's start with Maynard and Concord, where most of the industry settled because of their proximity to the Assabet River and the hydropower that the river provided. In 1847, Amory Maynard founded the Assabet Woolen Mills of Maynard, one of the largest producers of woolen clothing and blankets in the whole country. The Assabet Mills was the town's anchor for decades, and they flourished until the 1950s when they closed their doors. Now, when you drive through Maynard today, those same mill buildings dominate the center of town, and they're home to multiple businesses. Prior to that, in 1957, Digital Equipment Corporation established itself there, and Maynard went on to become the mini-computer capital of the world. Now, in West Concord, there were several companies I'd like to mention. There was the Pail Factory that took pine timbers and made wooden pails and bathtubs. Yes, that's right, bathtubs, wooden bathtubs. Other companies included the Allen Chair and Furniture Company, the powder mills that manufactured gunpowder, and the Neshoba Brook Pencil Factory. I think that fabric producer Damon Mills would be considered the largest business in West Concord. Damon Mills had their own train stop, and trains were central to West Concord's development. Fitchburg and Framingham Lowell train lines were the two main lines stopping in West Concord. On a typical day, more than 125 freight and passenger trains stopped at Union Station, and with all the shops on Main Street and Com Ave, well, it created a real vibrancy to the area. Now I'd like to turn to farming. It was so important to our area, and I'd like to welcome Littleton Historical Society member Ann Lawrence, who will talk about the history of farming and how it all developed. Ann, thanks so much for being with me.
Thanks, Bob. It's good to be here.
Now we're going to talk about farming, not your typical, stereotypical rather, 9-to-5 job. It's hard work.
It is.
And how did we all start in our area?
Well, the railroads were a significant mode of transport for shipping milk and farm produce to the city and expanding opportunities for the residents of the town of Littleton and other towns. So we need some context and history for these developments. In 1654, the Neshoba Plantation was founded by the Great and General Court of the province of Mass Bay. There were 10 families, about 50 inhabitants, to settle and farm in Neshoba Plantation. And we still have some of those family names in town today, like Shepherd and Powers. The purpose of the General Court was twofold: to convert the Native Americans to Christianity through the work of John Eliot, and to protect the Native people from land speculators. So the land deeded to the Indians could not be sold without permission from the court. The settlers were farmers, and they brought with them the corn, beans, and pumpkins, the Three Sisters they're called, that the natives grew that had sustained the English settlers through the winter. And these farmers were self-sufficient and industrious. They built houses, barns, and roads. They used the rocks from improved land to build foundations and stone walls. The land also had open meadows, which were vital for keeping cows and other livestock and to provide hay for domestic animals through the winter. The disbandment of the Great and General Court in 1686 allowed for the sale of some of the land. And the proprietor's book of records show that the sale of land far exceeded the requirement of 35 families. So who were these farmers in 1850? So the census of 1865 showed 226 families in Littleton. 123 men indicated they were farmers. Frank B. Priest compiled a list of 83 farms in town. The smallest farm had 4 acres, and the largest 400 acres. Many farms hired field laborers and women to help in the homes. Some of the farmers were skilled in other trades. They were craftsmen and could make furniture. They set up mills for grinding grain and making lumber. There was harness repair and shoemaking. There was barter and local markets in Concord and Groton. It was a long way to Boston by wagon and oxen. The long store on 119 was a center of some commerce and a place to meet people. Besides the usual garden produce, these farmers grew apples and barley to make ciders, vinegars, and other apple products. Neither apples nor barley were native to New England, and the seedlings were shipped from abroad. Even the Native Americans began growing apples. You will recognize the names of these farmers: Whitcomb, Tuttle, Proctor, Harwood, and others. Joseph Harwood decided to make his land highly a fruit and hay farm. He wrote that he had 300 apple trees on 20 acres that produced 400 barrels of apples a year. At one time, Littleton was the largest exporter of apples to Europe. And in 1879, Sheehan's cider mill on Harvard Road processed 9,350 barrels of cider. And later, this industry was purchased by the Rouse family and named New England Vinegar Works, and later renamed Very Fine. Its products were shipped worldwide.
They became so big that Very Fine was a international brand.
Right.
And eventually, of course, Very Fine was sold, I believe, to Kraft Foods.
Right.
Who sold it to another large company as well after that. But the farmers, Ann, let's talk about this, if we could get into a little bit of some of the other things that they did when growing season was not around any longer. For instance, in the wintertime, we had situations where they would make their own ice.
Yes.
They would get into the ponds. I believe they called them sink ponds, but they would cut ice, insulate that ice, and be able to store things.
That is correct. And in fact, behind my house, there still is an access road that was used to drain the swamp, and then they would reflood the pond, and it would freeze, and they would go out with horses and sledges and cut ice, and they would shoot it under Mill Road to an ice house in that area.
I think it's absolutely fascinating to me. Here you have ice, and now you're insulating the ice with hay or sawdust, and it keeps it intact.
Yes, right through the summer, so that you could have refrigeration, and of course, if you wanted ice for your ice box, you could purchase it from a local vendor.
Right. But I'm sorry, when I interrupted you, you started mentioning some of the other skills that the farmers had, because they had to have another income outside of the growing season.
Right. Actually, shoemaking and shoe repairs was a big business in this town, along with harness repair and the mills, like Warren's Mill and other mills were set up for grinding grain in the fall. And then they were also converted to lumber, sawing planks and lumber.
Now we're getting into, we're starting to approach the 20th century, and we're starting to see some technological changes in farming.
Yes, technological advances and how it changed farming. Fortunately, or even unfortunately, the town is situated on two well-traveled routes, Route 2A and 119, which were not called that in those days. And of course, these roads were always in need of repair. Trips by oxen and wagon to markets in Groton and Concord were an adventure, and they were time-consuming. In 1844, the railroad came to town. There were 3 railroad lines that came through the local areas: the Fitchburg Railroad, the Stony Brook Railroad, and the Bar Harbor Line. The Fitchburg Railroad became the B&M line and is now the MBTA commuter rail. This new transportation opened up many fast and easy marketing opportunities. Besides vegetables and milk, the farmers sold wood, railroad ties, shingles, and other products and shipped them by train into Boston. And of course, it moved the farmers into a new economy. Some of the wealthier farmers and businessmen invested $500 each to ensure the location and completion of the railroad through the town. There was much discussion as to the location of the railway. The folks at the Common did not want it there. The railroad commissioners wanted it to go through less settled areas. The stagecoach companies were against the railroad altogether, feeling it would ruin their business, which it did. And so the depot area where the railroad tracks went, it grew with warehouses to ship and receive goods, grain, farm equipment, household furnishings. Along the line, there were a number of depots and waiting rooms where passengers could board the train to Boston for business, education, and cultural events. Of course, the railroad had its own problems. There were some derailments and wrecks. And so the town grew and changed. Roads were paved. Automobiles were everywhere to a certain extent. Trucking took over. Trading and bartering changed to actual currency. There were mills in town and industry. There was electricity, and telephones changed the way people lived and ordered items.
But I want to interject. We're going to go back to railroads for a second. Just before we started taping the show, you were telling me that your grandfather was actually the station master, whatever the title was. He was in charge of the Union Railroad Station in West Concord, and your father in the Littleton Station.
That is correct. And my great-grandfather was also a railroad man in charge of some of the working crews that put the railroad together. And my grandfather, Wayne, was agent and operator at the Tower in Winchester, and also he worked in West Concord. And my father, Russell, was agent and operator for the B&M Railroad here in Littleton. And he also worked at times at the depot in West Concord.
That's amazing.
It is. It is. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any recollections from when your father was involved in the Littleton Station? They closed the commuter rail, I believe, closed down in the early 70s.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. And he retired in 76, 77. I live right across the street from the original railroad depot, and we saw a change from steam, coal locomotives up through diesel to Bud cars to now the MBTA has control of it. And I can remember trains going into Boston with military equipment, tanks on them. And I can also remember circus trains going through, and they were painted with whatever animal was inside the car. And cattle cars taking animals to market.
Yeah. It's just amazing.
It is
And of course,
amazing.
now we have that, well, we have had the new railroad station now off of Foster Street for several years now. And you did mention to me there's a little known fact about something called a quarantine station. Exactly what is that?
Well, there was a quarantine station in Waltham where animals for market were detained and inspected for health before they were sent into Boston for food. And then that quarantine station closed, and it was moved to the town of Littleton. So Joseph Harwood had 33 acres near Mill Pond in this town, and there was a railroad siding there for unloading and loading animals. 19 quarantine buildings were transported by rail from Waltham to that holding site, and that's where market cattle were detained for health. The trains now are primarily passenger cars, commuters to and from Boston. There are occasional tank car exchanges at the Pepsi plant, and that exchange, which actually happened just yesterday, holds up many impatient car drivers at the crossing while they switch out full cars and empty cars. The warehouse siding from warehouse days is still there. Trucking has taken over the transport of many items, but the railroad still sends some freight trains through the town.
And of course, the Pepsi station, the company that you mentioned is where Very Fine formerly had been.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
oh, very fascinating. And farming still is a
We're still
24-hour
farming.
day job.
Right, and there are still several farms and farm stands along Route 119, and there's still one dairy farm in the town, but that milk is taken away by truck now, not by train.
Okay. Yeah, it's just, there's not another suburban town this close to Boston that has 3 farm stands consecutively
Right.
on top of one
Right.
another, pretty much.
Yeah.
So we still have farming here a little
Yes,
bit.
we do. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Ann.
Thank you.
It's been very informative, and thank you.
Good.
And thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.